Hello, I'm Nancy deClaissé-Walford. I'm a retired Emerita professor of Old Testament and Biblical Languages at Mercer University School of Theology, and I'm pleased to be here today.
Nancy, good to see you. Welcome to Exegetically Speaking.
Thank you.
It's a delight to have you with us. How did you get started reading Hebrew?
I have always wanted to teach. I did a bachelor's degree in ancient languages and started looking at PhD programs, hoping that I would be able to complete a degree and teach ancient history to students. I found out that I probably would be wise to have a ancient language under my belt
Hmm,
before I started a PhD program.
right.
So Fuller Theological Seminary, I was living in California at the time. Fuller was right around the corner from me. So I enrolled in their 12-hour intensive Hebrew program. Just, I thought, in preparation to move on to a PhD program. As it turns out, I fell in total love with the Hebrew language. Found out that Fuller had a degree in Semitic languages and literature. So I went on. I did advanced Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, Ugaritic, Akkadian,
All those languages.
Egyptian,
Wow.
Greek. Yes, all of those. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're going to be doing a podcast pretty soon with Adam Miglio on what is Akkadian. So that'll
Oh,
be,
wonderful.
yeah, so he'll be joining us here pretty soon, and that'll be a podcast will be dropping here. So we're today going to talk about, since you're an Old Testament specialist, the Hebrew, of the book called Kohelet. Now, some people would say, well, I don't know that book in my Bible. It's the book called Ecclesiastes. Why do you prefer to call it Kohelet?
Koheles is the Hebrew name for the book. Ecclesiastes is the name that was assigned when the Old Testament was translated, I should say the Hebrew Bible, translated into the Greek language. So that's the Septuagint, the Greek title for this book. But in Hebrew, it's Koheleth.
And what does that translate into if we were to translate Kohelet?
Koheleth can mean either teacher or preacher, but it's basically the whole idea of someone who gathers, whether you're gathering information, you're gathering students, you're gathering people who want to listen to what you say. So Koheleth is a gatherer of information and listeners.
Well, one of the passages that has fascinated me, and you and I have talked about this before on a couple of occasions, is that of Ecclesiastes or Kohelet chapter 1, verse 2. And let me just read it from the New Revised Standard Version. And I know you've
Mm-hmm,
done kind of a survey of some other
mm-hmm,
translations as well.
mm-hmm.
So the words of the teacher, right? The son of David, king of Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. So what are we to make of that? There's lots of different renderings of that, aren't there?
That phrase, vanity of vanities, is hevel, hevelim. So the word we're going to concentrate on today is hevel. And for those of you who know some Hebrew, it's hey, bait, lamed. So hevel. And that word actually occurs some 75 times in the Hebrew Bible.
Hmm.
And of course, over half of those occurrences are in the book of Koheleth or Ecclesiastes. And as you've pointed out, in the majority of translations, that word is translated vanity. And then it's vanity of vanities, which is a superlative. It's the worst, it's the best of the vanities, it's the most of the vanities. So the authorized, or King James Version, translates it vanity of vanities. The New American Standard, the Revised Standard, the New Revised Standard, the English Standard. So this translation that has really become fixed for those words. And I'm going to talk about that a little later. Where did it come from? Where
Yeah.
do we get this idea of vanity?
Well, it doesn't communicate too well today, does it? Because our word
It,
vanity
it does
means
not.
like arrogance, or
Right.
vanity can be the thing where placed in your house where you brush your teeth, or something like that.
I remember it's this place my mother sat in front of to put her makeup
Put
on.
her makeup
That
on.
was the vanity. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
But
That was, and do her hair
that's right.
and do
So
her hair.
vanity of
Yeah.
vanities. That's the best
Yeah.
vanity there is. So all
Okay.
right. So let's dive deep into this.
Okay.
All right. So it occurs 70 something times in the whole Hebrew Bible,
Hmm.
38
Hmm.
times here in the book of Kohelet.
Right.
And some of these other translations, what are they? I mean, not vanity, but you were reading from some earlier that just had some very interesting ways of translating it, like meaningless, meaningless. Life is meaningless, or something to the effect. What are
Right,
some of
right.
those?
Yeah. The one you just quoted, that's from the New International Version, meaningless, meaningless. And the Common English Bible has perfectly pointless. And then I went and checked the Jewish Publication Society Tanakh, which is the standard Hebrew Bible, utter futility, utter futility. And so we have to ask ourselves, where did this idea come from? Because what does Hevel actually mean? Well, this idea of vanity that has stuck with us, we have to travel all the way back to the fourth century to the Latin translation done by Jerome, which has become known as the Vulgate. And I think it's important when we look at Bible translators, who were they? Where did they come from? What was their theological bent? What was their mindset as
Yeah.
they were doing these translations? Because we have to remember that Bible translation is some of the most conservative in terms of tradition. So trace it all the way back to Jerome. Jerome was an aesthetic, which means he retreated from this world and embraced a life of prayer and penance to achieve a level of spirituality that would prepare him for the next world. So, not so much concern about this life as about the next. So, Jerome chose to translate the opening words of Koheleth, Hevel, Hevelim, as vanitas vanitatum, and all 38 occurrences of that word in the book of Koheleth, he translated as vanitas. In Jerome's day, remember how language changes over time. The Latin word carried the meaning of emptiness or worthless action. And I think that was a reflection of his attitude about life, that this life is worthless in comparison to the life that is to come. So we go back to that very conservative ideas about what does the Bible actually say? What are the words? And I posed this to you earlier. If I ask you folks to recite the 23rd Psalm to me, I think most people would come up with the King James Version, even though that's probably not the translation that you use anymore.
Yeah.
And we have to remember that the Vulgate, that Latin translation of the scriptures, was the scriptures of the church until the Reformation. So we're
So
talking centuries of
thousand
tradition.
years, right? More than 1,000 years.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I've got a good apocryphal story. I hope it's correct in reference to Jerome's translation work. And I thought this was quite amusing. Augustine, you remember him,
Uh huh.
reports an account of a tumult that erupted in a North African church during the reading of a scripture lesson from the book of Jonah. When the congregation heard that Jonah took shelter from the sun under some ivy, that is in chapter 6, verse 4, Herida or Hedera, with one accord they shouted, Gourd, gourd. That was the traditional translation, until the reader reinstated the old word, lest there be a general exodus of the congregation. A gourd or ivy in Jonah? So you can understand how those translations get entrenched within us.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Shall we talk about what Hevel actually
Yeah,
means?
let's talk about what hevel means exactly, because it doesn't
Okay.
exactly mean vanity as we understand it.
First of all, it's a noun in Hebrew with no underlying common Semitic verbal root, which is very unusual in Semitic languages. Nouns are usually derived from some sort of verbal root. For instance, the underlying verbal root of the word melech, which means king, is malak, to rule or reign. The underlying verbal root of the word shofet, judge, which is the title of our book, Judges, right, is shafat, to pass judgment. Hevel doesn't have any of that underlying meaning. So it seems to have been an onomatopoeic word formation in Hebrew. Onomatopoeia,
What does that mean exactly?
the meaning of the word is associated with the sound that the word makes. Hevel,
Ah.
hevel, hevel. It means wind, breath, or breeze. And that's the meaning we find of the word in other Semitic languages like Syriac, Aramaic, or Mandean, breeze, vapor, breath, or wind. And so the idea of fleeting, ephemeral, connected with Hevel. But I don't see a meaninglessness or uselessness in Koheleth's use of the word.
Well, I'm wondering, when people have proposed those translations, have they not done the kind of work that you've done here to figure that out? Or by saying it's meaningless, or by saying it's. I remember even seeing one translation that said something like life is absurd, something to that effect,
Mm-hmm,
which I
mm-hmm,
don't
mm-hmm.
remember which translation that is. That just seems like it's really taken a lot of angles at that word
Right,
what it does
right.
mean.
Yep, yep. Can I tell my personal story?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. About 10 years ago, I was approached by the editors of a new Bible translation called The Voice.
Ah,
And
okay.
one of those editors is sitting right here with me and was asked if I would undertake a translation of Koheleth. The translation was to be a dynamic equivalent, but with an eye to capture what the editors, you, described as the grit, humor, passion, and beauty of the biblical text. I was free to not slavishly render the Hebrew text word for word or phrase for phrase, but to be a bit playful with the text, doing my best to make it readable and understandable. So I took this on as a challenge. It was a refreshing new way for me to look at the biblical text.
Good, good.
Well, I hit my first snag in chapter 1, verse 2. Hevel, Hevelim, vanity of vanities.
Yeah, yeah.
So I chose to translate this verse as, you ready?
Yep.
Understanding life is like trying to catch hold of the breath that comes out of my mouth. I try to grasp it, but it always slips through my fingers. It is breath, it is vapor. Breath of breaths, all is breath. And the word vanity never appears in my translation of Koheleth.
Uh,
And my rendering of Hevel as breath or catching hold of the breath that comes out of my mouth seemed a fitting rendering of Hevel because it's used over and over in parallel with the phrase chasing after the wind.
yes.
For instance, my translation of 114, I considered all that had been done under the sun, and indeed it is Hevel, like trying to catch hold of the breath that comes out of my mouth or trying to embrace the wind.
Mm.
But as I've said, Bible translation is a conservative and tricky
It
business. In the
is.
end, yes, in the end, the voice translation that you'll see in print renders chapter 1, verse 2 as life is fleeting, like a passing mist. I like that. And it's like trying to catch hold of a breath. I like that. All vanishes like a vapor. I like that. Everything is a great vanity.
That was not my decision.
Couldn't let go. Couldn't let go.
Yep, yep, yep. The folks at Thomas Nelson said, "Oh, we've got to have that word vanity in there somehow, some way."
The conservativeness and tradition based
Yes,
of,
yes,
of translations of the biblical text.
yeah.
So,
I would just commend your translation of that particular book because I think it's one of the best things about that translation. And this is really interesting the way you've traced all these other usages of the word all the way back to Jerome. I had no
mhm,
idea that it went all the way back there. And so we have, as you know, we have all of these language and language families at some point feeding the river that becomes the Hebrew language. And it'd be
right.
fascinating to figure out, if we could, where that ultimately came from. But this is a great lesson for today. Nancy, thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking.
It has been my delight. Thank you so much.
If you learned too much today and your head is hurting, there is one sure cure. That is to share this podcast with a friend. If you've never visited Wheaton College, I hope you'll make plans to do so. We have a wonderful campus all year round. And if biblical languages are your fancy, check out the MA and the BA program at Wheaton College. You can go to wheaton.edu, look for modern and classical languages, get started today. This is the day you want to do it, right? If you have questions or comments, if you just want to be in touch, please email us at exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. That's exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. Thanks to all those who make this podcast possible. You know who you are. Until next time, thanks for listening.